and indeed an uncle became a very important player in the process of reintegration of that 14-year-old girl. And not only were there apologies to the victims of her burglaries and doing what she could to do a bit of community work. I think it might have been painting some fences. She didn't have much in the way of money she could give back that which she still did have, do a bit of work for these families, apologise to them, but in the plan of action, give undertakings to go back to school. She wasn't going to school at all, and to help her to find members of the extended family who she could live with as an alternative to living with her mother, so that the underlying root causes of homelessness and dropout from school were addressed in the conference through the agencies of other members of the family, such as an uncle who steps in when they can see that the parents are not the ones who are going to show the leadership to solve this problem. A lot of the research and development on restorative justice was done on crime, but now we're seeing more and more evaluation of applications of restorative justice in other areas. For example, child protection, children who've been neglected or abused by their family group conferences to come up with a plan of action with that kind of problem. Also with children, for restorative justice for bullying in schools and other kinds of misbehaviours and conflicts that occur in school grounds, where sometimes children are learning themselves to be the facilitators of the conferences. Now, the reason we think in this what's now become a social movement for restorative justice, that restorative justice in schools is particularly important, is that, today there's a lot of cynicism about democracy, that elites run everything, and that children, this worry that children are not getting opportunities to learn how to be active democratic citizens. We're not born democratic. We need to learn how to be democratic, how to take active responsibility for righting the wrongs. And restorative justice is about this idea of active responsibility. Traditional criminal law is about passive responsibility. We will hold you responsible for what you have done in the past. Restorative justice is about active responsibility, about citizens taking responsibility for putting things right into the future. It's about a democratic virtue of active citizenship, not just on the part of the offender, but on the part of those supporters who come along to the restorative justice process to help mend, reconcile, create a record that there's a truth that needs to be told about an injustice that has been done here. All cultures have restorative justice traditions, and they have punitive, retributive traditions for dealing with violence against them. And what the social movement for restorative justice is about is saying to people, in this context of an opportunity now arising for peacemaking, your restorative justice traditions are going to be more useful for you than your retributive traditions. There is evidence that elite mediation with war can be effective, but the evidence is also that it's often not very effective in bringing about a permanent peace. That is to say, if there are still the hatreds in the hearts of those two people which haven't been dealt with by the elite mediation, that there's a risk that that conflict will break out in the next generation. The child who has seen their parents abused, tortured in their village will be looking for the opportunity when they become adults to exact revenge. And one of the things we're learning about restorative justice in armed conflict is that while these elite negotiations between warlords and heads of state take a long time to come to agreement. It takes meeting after meeting after meeting, and then a lot of time to disarm the armies that are involved in the conflict. During the years and months while that's going on, ordinary people can begin to reconcile village to village. So we saw this very well, for example, in the armed conflict between Muslims and Christians 10 years ago in Ambon and Maluku provinces of Indonesia, for example, where one of the things we saw happening was Christian villagers who had raided a nearby Muslim village, burning down the houses, burning down the mosque, killing a lot of people, start to rebuild the mosque to invite the Muslims who have fled to come back. And other cases in that same area where Muslim communities start rebuilding the Christian church and then invite the Christian community to come back. Those sort of acts of reconciliation, and sometimes whole villages aren't ready to take those collective steps toward reconciliation. It might be just one person who knew that they were responsible for burning down a particular house in the village down the road and start the work on rebuilding that single house. And that little micro relationship between that perpetrator of violence and that victim then becomes a bridge which expands between connecting these two villages back together. Mary Kaldor uses the notion in her book New and Old War of islands of civility. She thinks that after any armed conflict you can always find, if you look hard enough, some islands of civility. So where people are continuing to live peaceably together, notwithstanding all of the conflict and hatred and killing that's been going on around them. So her idea is you start out working in civil society with that islands of civility and try to gradually expand out that island of civility, and you do that kind of work while the top-down peace building is also occurring. So you're doing peace building bottom up, top down, and also middle out in all directions. So restorative justice is a philosophy of how we live our daily lives as well. And it's when people do the most terrible injustice to us that we have the greatest opportunities to do that special kind of good in the world through taking the restorative path rather than the vengeful path. And it's through seeing how extraordinary people do that in public space as well, who have more public lives, like the Dalai Lama, like Nelson Mandela, who's capable of doing something that most of us would not be capable of doing after 28 years in harsh conditions in a prison of apartheid South Africa, breaking rocks in the sun. He's able, when he's inaugurated as president of South Africa, to invite to sit along beside him the men who were his jailers during those years.